There is a hidden truth about God that most people never fully believe, even if they've heard it their entire lives. He notices you before you ever notice him. His gaze reaches you long before your prayer rises. His attention settles upon your soul long before you try to earn it. His love moves toward you before you take a single step in his direction. People imagine God as someone who responds to effort, to virtue, to devotion, to progress. But Saint Thérèse of Lisieux discovered the opposite. God's first movement is always toward the smallest, the weakest, the most hidden ones, those who believe they have nothing impressive to offer. Let me ask you something honestly. Have you ever thought that God would notice you more if you prayed better, believed stronger, sinned less, or became more spiritually consistent? Have you ever felt invisible to him because of your faults or ordinariness? Thérèse once felt this too. Before she became a saint, before she became a doctor of the church, before her little way was known to the world, she believed she was spiritually insignificant. She saw herself as fragile, limited, and small, and she assumed this smallness placed her far from God's attention. But then she discovered a truth that changed everything. God does not notice you because you are strong. He notices you because you are his, and he notices you first. Thérèse realized that before she even formed a thought of love for God, he was already loving her. Before she reached for holiness, he had already bent down toward her. Before she desired him, he desired her infinitely more. This is the way God notices you first. He sees your longing even when you barely recognize it yourself. He sees your exhaustion long before you admit it. He sees your desire to change before you take the first step. He sees your hidden tears, your unspoken fears, your quiet efforts, especially the ones no one else sees. And in noticing you, he draws near. Thérèse understood that God's gaze is not like human attention. Humans notice what is impressive. God notices what is vulnerable. Humans value achievement. God values sincerity. Humans are drawn to confidence. God is drawn to humility. What touched Thérèse most deeply was this: God notices you at the exact moment you feel least noticeable. When your prayer feels weak, when your heart feels inconsistent, when your mind is scattered, when you are distracted, discouraged, or spiritually tired, even then, especially then, he sees you first. God's first gaze is not a reward. It is initiation. It is invitation. It is the beginning of grace. Thérèse believed that holiness does not begin with human effort. It begins with God noticing the soul and loving it into courage. The little way is not about climbing to God, but about letting God stoop down to you. Before you lift your eyes to him, his eyes are already on you. Before you whisper his name, he has already spoken yours in eternity. And once the soul realizes this, everything changes, because it finally understands that it was never unseen to begin with. There is something mysterious and beautiful about the way God draws near to a soul. It is rarely loud. It is rarely dramatic. It is never forced. Instead, it resembles the slow unfolding of morning light, gradual, gentle, so subtle that you often don't realize what's happening until everything around you is illuminated. Let me ask you something quietly. Have you ever looked back at a difficult season and realized God had been guiding you through it long before you knew you needed his help? Have you ever discovered that the very desires drawing you toward him were not your own doing but his? This is how God notices you first. He plants holy desires before you have the courage to act on them. He stirs longing before you find words for it. He awakens the soul before the soul even understands what is happening. This hidden work was the foundation of Saint Thérèse of Lisieux's entire spirituality. Thérèse realized that her smallest impulses toward God, tiny movements of love, brief acts of trust, sudden interior tenderness, were not signs of her spiritual strength, but signs that God had already turned toward her. His grace was always the first to move. What touched Thérèse so deeply was the discovery that God initiates love gently through small interior invitations. A sudden awareness of your need for him, a brief moment of gratitude you didn't expect, a desire to pray that appears in the middle of a restless day, a quiet tug on the heart telling you to forgive, to trust, to surrender. These movements are not self-generated. They are God bending down, noticing you and drawing you forward by grace. Thérèse believed that most people overlook these invitations because they seem so ordinary. They expect God to arrive with clarity, fireworks, or unmistakable signs. But God often begins with subtleties, not spectacles. He notices you in the places where you feel unworthy of attention. He meets you in the moments when you feel spiritually inconsistent. He calls you in whispers long before you are steady enough to answer him loudly. Thérèse saw that God chooses the smallest openings in the human heart, the slightest willingness, the tiniest hope, the faintest desire, and magnifies them with his love. He notices you before you are even aware of being noticed. This is why Thérèse insisted that holiness is not the result of spiritual talent. It does not begin with discipline. It does not rely on emotional intensity. It begins the moment the soul realizes, God's gaze reached me long before I reached him. And once the soul recognizes this truth, something tender begins to happen inside it. It stops trying to impress God. It stops assuming that he waits for perfection. It stops believing that his love is earned. It finally understands that all God ever needed was the smallest movement of the heart, and even that was his gift. You were not the one who began this story. You were the one who responded to a story already unfolding around you. And in this humble realization, the soul begins to experience God not as a distant observer, but as a loving presence who has always been one step ahead, waiting for the moment you would notice him noticing you. There is a quiet miracle happening in every soul, yet most people live their entire lives unaware of it. God sees something in you long before you ever see it in yourself. He notices the potential for holiness hidden beneath your fears, the tenderness beneath your defenses, the longing beneath your confusion. To him, nothing about you is ordinary, even if you feel painfully ordinary inside. Let me ask you something sincerely. Have you ever dismissed yourself spiritually because you believed others were holier, more disciplined, more passionate than you? Have you ever assumed God must love them more because their faith seems louder or clearer? This comparison wound is one of the greatest obstacles to spiritual growth, and it is precisely the wound that Saint Thérèse of Lisieux came to heal with her little way. Thérèse understood something most people overlook. God does not notice you because you are impressive. He notices you because you are beloved. He does not look at you the way you look at yourself. You see weaknesses. He sees openings. You see failures. He sees formation. You see inconsistency. He sees a heart capable of great love. You see smallness. He sees the exact size grace needs to operate freely. Thérèse was convinced that God is drawn to small souls, not despite their smallness, but because of it. Smallness creates space for him to act. Smallness prevents pride from taking root. Smallness teaches trust more effectively than strength ever could. When you feel spiritually invisible, God sees you with even greater tenderness. When you feel unworthy, he sees sincerity beneath your fears. When you feel lost, he sees the desire that brought you to him in the first place. This is why Thérèse often described God's gaze as anticipating love. His attention meets the soul not at the peak of its virtue, but at the beginning of its desire. He does not wait for you to become who you think you should be. He meets you exactly where you are, knowing that his love, not your effort, will transform you. What moved Thérèse most deeply was the realization that God notices the slightest effort. A tiny act of patience, a whispered prayer in exhaustion, an incomplete attempt at forgiveness, a moment of trust during uncertainty. These small acts, invisible to others, shine brightly before God. To him, they are signals, signs of willingness, seeds of holiness, open doors for grace. Others may overlook these small movements. You yourself may overlook them, but God never does. Thérèse said that God looks at the intention long before the accomplishment. Your desire to love him pleases him, even before you manage to express that love clearly. And this changes everything. Because once the soul understands that God notices it, before it grows, before it succeeds, before it matures, then fear loses its grip. The soul no longer tries to prove its worthiness. Instead, it allows itself to be seen, really seen, by a God who delights in the very places you feel the least remarkable. The spiritual life becomes no longer a climb, but a surrender, no longer a performance, but a relationship. No longer a search for God's attention, but a resting in the truth that you already have it. There is a place inside every soul that feels too fragile, too flawed, or too unfinished to show to God. It might be a wound you haven't healed, a habit you haven't overcome, a regret you keep avoiding, or a part of yourself you wish didn't exist. Most people instinctively try to keep these areas hidden, believing that God must notice them with disappointment, or perhaps not notice them at all. But this is not how God sees, not according to Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, and not according to the logic of divine love. Let me ask you something gently. Have you ever felt that God pays more attention to the holiest parts of you than to the parts wrapped in weakness? Have you ever assumed he turns his face toward the successes but looks away from the struggles? Thérèse discovered the exact opposite. God notices you most tenderly exactly where you feel least worthy of being noticed. In her little way, she realized that God is not impressed by strengths, achievements, or stability. He is moved by dependence, vulnerability, and truthfulness. He notices the places where you tremble, the places where you fight quietly, the places where you feel too small to be seen. To Thérèse, this was the great inversion of divine love. God pays attention to what you try hardest to hide, not to expose you, not to shame you, not to correct you harshly, but to meet you there with mercy. Where you see a failing, he sees a door. Where you see shame, he sees an invitation. Where you see weakness, he sees the very place grace can take root. Thérèse wrote that God leans toward the soul when it is weakest, as a father bends down toward a wounded child, not to demand an explanation, but simply to lift. This means God notices not only your virtues but also your exhaustion, not only your prayers but also your attempts, not only your courage but also your trembling. And this noticing is never passive. God notices you in order to draw close. There is a tenderness in God's attentiveness that astonished Thérèse. She realized that the places she feared would distance God from her were actually the very places that attracted him. Her smallness did not repel him. It called him. Her imperfections were not obstacles. They were invitations. This is why she said that God loves to work in souls who know their nothingness, because only those souls leave room for him to be everything. Imagine for a moment, if the part of yourself you dislike the most is the part where God pays the most compassionate attention. Imagine if your hidden struggles shine brighter before him than your visible strengths. Imagine if the wounds you hide from others are the very places where God sits beside you quietly, waiting for you to notice his presence. This is the truth Thérèse lived and died believing. God does not begin to notice you when you become strong. He notices you where you are still learning to trust. And the moment the soul accepts this, really accepts it, fear loosens, shame dissolves, and prayer becomes less a striving and more a gentle unveiling of the heart. You do not have to hide from a God who sees you most clearly in the places you think he would ignore. There is a moment in every spiritual journey that happens quietly, almost secretly, long before the soul recognizes it. It is the moment when a subtle shift begins inside you, a softening of the heart, a flicker of renewed desire, a gentler response to grace, and yet you don't attribute it to holiness. You don't even think of it as growth. You simply feel different in ways you can't name. And what you do not notice in yourself, God has already seen forming. Let me ask you something sincerely. Have you ever surprised yourself by choosing patience over irritation, compassion over judgment, or trust over fear, and afterward felt as if something beyond your strength had helped you? Have you ever acted with more love than you thought you had? This is one of the ways God notices you first. He sees the beginnings of transformation before you realize transformation has begun. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux understood this mystery better than most. She knew that the spiritual life rarely announces itself. It grows quietly, like roots beneath the soil. And because it is so gentle, so gradual, the soul often mistakes divine work for ordinary movement. But God never mistakes it. He notices every slight turn of your heart, the moment you pause instead of reacting, the quiet decision to forgive someone internally, the brief prayer whispered in the middle of a chaotic day, the instinct to choose kindness even when tired. These tiny interior shifts, barely visible to you, shine brilliantly before God. Thérèse realized that God watches the growth of the soul the way a mother watches the first movements of her child, not with judgment, not with impatience, but with awe, with tenderness, with joy. Even when the soul feels stuck or inconsistent, God sees something entirely different. He sees momentum. He sees desire awakening. He sees change in its earliest form. Holiness does not begin with perfection. It begins with direction. And God notices the direction long before you do. Thérèse often marveled at the fact that God celebrated her littlest victories, the silent ones, the invisible ones, the ones she assumed didn't matter. Her smile offered to someone who irritated her, her restraint when tempted to complain, her willingness to trust when she felt nothing. She once said that God notices the faintest look toward him, as if it were a great act of love. Imagine that. Your faintest look is seen as love. This changes everything, because it means God notices your soul turning toward him even when you think you're turning too slowly. He notices the seeds of virtue even when you believe they're too small to matter. He notices progress even when you feel motionless. You may think your spiritual life is stagnant. God sees movement. You may think your efforts are insignificant. God sees transformation. You may think he's waiting for you to become holy. God sees holiness already beginning to take shape. The soul rarely recognizes its own growth because grace is subtle, humble, and non-dramatic. But God sees what is unfolding beneath the surface, and he delights in it. This is one of the most intimate ways he notices you first. He sees who you are becoming before you dare to believe you can become it. There comes a moment, not dramatic, not loud, but deeply transformative, when the soul suddenly understands something that had been true from the beginning. God has been noticing you far longer, far deeper, and far more tenderly than you ever imagined. His attention was not something you earned. It was the starting point of your story. Let me ask you something with quiet honesty. Have you ever had a moment where you looked back over years of your life and suddenly saw a thread running through everything, something steady, subtle, protective, almost as if someone had been guiding you long before you had words for it? Have you ever realized in hindsight that God had been closer during your weakest seasons than during your strongest? This realization is the doorway into the heart of Saint Thérèse of Lisieux's little way. Because Thérèse believed that holiness is not what happens when we finally notice God. It is what happens when we finally notice that he has been noticing us all along. Everything changes when the soul sees this. It stops striving for God's approval, because it finally understands it never lacked it. It stops fearing invisibility, because it realizes it was never unseen. It stops trying to earn closeness, because closeness was always offered freely. It stops interpreting difficulty as abandonment, because it recognizes that God's gaze does not waver in storms. For Thérèse, the greatest spiritual awakening was not that she loved God. It was that he had loved her first, with an attention that never dimmed, not even in her smallest or most fragile moments. Imagine for a moment what it does to the heart when it finally believes this. Imagine recognizing that every longing you ever had for God was a response, not an initiative. Imagine discovering that every step you took toward him was prompted by his footsteps behind you and ahead of you. Imagine realizing that even your desire to seek him was his way of seeking you. This is the mystery Thérèse lived. God notices the soul before the soul notices God. He desires the soul before the soul desires him. He chooses the soul before the soul chooses him. And once the soul sees this truth, really sees it, it finds rest. Not the kind of rest that distracts or numbs, but the rest that allows a person to finally breathe without fear of disappointing him. The rest that frees the soul from comparison with others. The rest that makes prayer gentle, simple, intimate. The rest that turns daily life, even the smallest acts, into encounters with a God who is already looking at you. In this light, Thérèse's little way becomes not a strategy for holiness, but a recognition of divine tenderness. The soul walks simply because it knows someone is watching over each step. The soul loves imperfectly because it knows someone delights even in its imperfect offering. The soul dares to trust because it understands it was never outside the gaze of the one who created it. And when the soul finally rests in that truth, something profound happens. It stops searching for ways to get God's attention. It begins to live from the peace of already having it. The spiritual life no longer feels like a climb but a being carried. No longer like effort but like belonging. No longer like proving yourself but like allowing yourself to be loved. This is the way God notices you first, and the way Thérèse invites you to notice him in return.